Annette, hi. It's such a joy to see you.
Hey girl, how you doing?
When I started, I had this idea of speaking to people about speaking and listening. You are someone I admired for so long. I fangirled out on you years ago and took a course that you taught in New York. I've devoured your books, and to call you both a colleague and a friend now is one of the greatest compliments I can give myself. And I'm so thrilled to speak with you today. When
Well,
I,
you're one of my favorite. You're one of my favorites as well. The time we spent in Cuba, we had such a blast, and it's just so fun to be to know somebody who feels the same way about our work. Because I don't know about you, but I don't run into a whole lot of people. A lot of people want to kind of control the work so that they can make a whole bunch of money, and yeah, we need that, but to really genuinely feel moved from the inside out to do good in the world. I feel like that about you.
you're you're incredibly kind and wonderful to speak with and generous. So when I wrote to you and said I've started this series and I'd like to speak with you about speaking and listening, what was your thought about that meta invitation?
Well, it was funny because my first thought, even though I actually kind of as a living the speaking thing, is that it's actually listening comes first. And I was surprised by my own thought. It has to do with the way that I have written all the books that I've written, or the way that any opinion I've come to has been a result of listening, if you will, not just to the research that's already been produced, but primarily my research has always been asking people to tell me true stories about whatever subject it is, because I have learned that there's a difference between the theory in the books and the truth, if you will. And so I realized that my entire career depends on listening the stories out of people, listening the truth out of people, so that then I can aggregate it and go share it with somebody else. And so when I spoke, for instance, my first book was about territorial games. When I spoke on that topic, people really resonated with it, but it was only because I was repeating back to them what they already knew was true, but they couldn't prove it. And so I've learned that really, I guess, if I had to choose, listening is definitely the most important one.
You say that you're listening the truth out of people. Does it sometimes take a while to get to the truth?
Well, I think my experience is, because you and I both, giving speeches and facilitating, we are subject to the bear trap questions. And somebody's saying, yeah, but what about, or I don't think everybody agrees with that. Just the I learned this from a specific situation. I'm referencing the specific situation where somebody's coming after me because possibly the ideas that I'm allowing to go free in the room are going to threaten maybe their turf or their resource base or whatever. What I know is that their first impulse is to be angry. That makes sense. That's my first impulse. Anybody messes with my territory. But when I listen, what happens is, if I listen well enough, they can hear themselves speak. And I can really, and I do it with empathy, because I'm the worst one of going off, and rah, 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 rah. And so I really identify with what that feels like. I have a lot of compassion for it. And then I have faith that they're a good person. And when I just hold on to that faith, that their creative intelligence is just trying to work its way out, I think it helps them bleed off what, maybe initially defensive emotions. And then they tell themselves the truth.
If I listen well enough, they can hear themselves speak.
Yeah.
That's my new favorite thing you've ever said. Are there times where people shouldn't listen? I'm working on listening now and trying to talk to people about listening. But one of the things I want to make clear is sometimes if it's too painful, that you should walk away. But you just said something like we can always find it in ourselves to do the listening. Do you think it's ever?
Well, when we can find it in ourselves to do the listening, then we can give that gift to somebody else. But if someone is using us, and very frequently I found myself on the end of a conversation where it ain't about me. It's not about anything good. It's simply someone, and at that point, it's actually, I think, most kind to them to interrupt their pattern.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that.
And by interrupting their pattern, sometimes I'll interrupt. I have a bad habit of that. And when it turns out well, I get forgiven for it. Of course, there's those other times, but the idea that, so gaslighting, let's just, go straight to one of the things. Gaslighting is something that's happening to women a lot, has been for centuries. And I'm writing about the Women in Power book right now. And so what I find is that I am listing the discrediting statements that men will usually say to a woman in order to get her to doubt herself. And actually, this isn't just a male-female thing. It's if you look at conversations, you can diagram, the patterns of look over there, and all the different ways that they can get the topic off of what we were introducing the topic as being. And so then I can, if it's personal, I may just walk away. But if I'm working, if it's facilitating a group, then I defer to what's the best for the collective here. And I will often ask the group so I really avoid this idea that there's a power struggle between me and somebody else when talking. Because the only time I facilitate talking is when I facilitate dialogue. And dialogue is, for one thing, one of the interesting things about what I discovered about dialogue is that I have to promise them that this is a temporary situation. We're going to talk about the dangerous truths, but you don't have to always be this open and this understanding. And so when I coach people for, a large group dialogue, one of the things that I do is make a distinction between this is not normal. You can't maintain this level of openness, understanding, and attention 24/7. And none of us can. Some of us have more trouble than others. But if we all agree to create a container, referencing Bill Isaac's work, to create a container where for this amount of time we have agreed we're going to deal with the tough questions, it changes the nature of the speaking and the listening long enough for a group to think as a collective. And really face the tough issues. It's kind of like the quiet time we need in order to face our own issues individually. We can create the opportunity for a group to face their issues as a collective by, and I call it the, I don't, those of us who are old enough to remember Get Smart, the cone of silence, right? Which everybody could hear through. Anyway, it's so funny. Anyway, so I call it the cone of dialogue. And we bring it down, and we've got some implicit agreements for the time that we're doing it. And then we can go back to just being regular humans. I think we ask too much of people to be talking and listening at these ideal states all the time. It's exhausting. Actually, an anecdote was, I was at a party once, and this guy had kind of cornered me and wouldn't let me go. And I really didn't want to talk to him, but I was, I was being nice and how we do, and go, oh, that's really interesting. So what I hear you saying is all that. And I had ducked out to the kitchen because I had to get away from this guy. He was a narcissist, and he was around. And a friend of mine who was a psychotherapist, I said, I have done everything I can to deal with this guy without being rude. And she said, girlfriend, you're off duty. This is your time. And I always remember it in that understanding the distinction between the time when I'm supposed to be listening to be of service, and the other times when I'm just trying to be a good person. And so it gives me more strength in those moments when I need it. And less shame in the moments when I'm just, I'm doing the best I can. I can apologize. Usually I'm around people who love me and I love them, and they tolerate a lot more than clients who I'm facilitating dialogue with. And not that they should tolerate any of that.
Thank you. You often are with clients in this ideal state of speaking and listening. You hear a lot.
Yeah.
When have you been really surprised by what you've heard, or have really seen something shift in a profound and surprising way?
Thanks for asking. It's, every time I facilitate dialogue and it works, and I would say it works about 70, 80% of the time. You can't go in and say, okay, we're going to have a 60-person, one conversation, for 3 hours, without understanding that sometimes it's not going to work, because, and I'll tell you a story about a time when it didn't, because, enough time has passed. So this one particular organization that it was in charge of budgeting, maybe for our federal government, I don't know, was having their annual retreat, and they pulled up with a big old truck full of leather office chairs. Now, my reaction as well. And what I found out the next day when I saw all the 60 leather office chairs and all of the people in the retreat sitting in them is that they had decided to budget money to make sure they didn't have to sit in uncomfortable chairs once a year. Now that tells me a little something about how they feel about discomfort. That group did not successfully dialogue. And later on, some of the people, because they always come up to you and say, oh, we need this, we've got to address these issues. And so I went up to one of them and I was like, so what happened? And he said, well, it's kind of like skinny dipping. You don't want to be the first one to take all your clothes off. And I was like, okay, gotta admit that. So in dialogue, when it works, the moving moment is when that first person decides to be vulnerable. And I've taken extensive notes of tons and tons of dialogue, mainly because I need to be disassociated from the group so that they're not watching me. They're actually paying attention to each other. But when it works, and like I said, it works, 70, 80% of the time, what you have is somebody is brave enough to tell the truth. And then somebody is brave enough, and that would usually be the manager, to listen to the truth. And when those two things happen, the energy in the field shifts. And everybody in that room realizes this is different. Wow, we're really going to do this thing. And then when they really do it, it's hard. It's really, really hard. The dialogue process is for some people, they're losing a lot to listen to what other people have to say. But at the end of it, that's the other moment, because it's like a rush of joy. And sometimes it's only a rush of relief because they've dealt with issues that they've been avoiding for a long time, and it's sobering. But to a person, you can tell they're glad they did it, because now they can move on.
You speak of bravery, and I know that you've written seminal books in the field of story and truth telling and honest conversation. And you're going back and revising one of them because you feel there are things that need to be said now that haven't been said. Can you share some of that bravery and how one goes back and changes or adds to a conversation you've been having for a long time with committed readers?
Well, I have, so what happened is that I wrote storytelling when I was in the romance honeymoon stage. I wrote The Story Factor when I was in the honeymoon stage. And because there is a stage where we discover story, and actually one of the first lines in the new chapters is a quote from Zora Neale Hurston: "Ships from a distance have every man's wish on board." And I think storytelling is that way. I think we look at storytelling and we're like, oh my God, all I need to do to change the circumstances is change the story. And then, wow, they didn't understand me. But if I tell them the story about something that happened, then, and so all of these things are just amazing, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And then about 15 years after I wrote the book, I am seeing people use storytelling to manipulate and do what they call control the narrative. So you've probably seen the TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. Well, that's what controlling a narrative is. It is silencing the other stories in favor of your own story. And that's abusive. And so initially I was like, how can I say that without sounding like, a grumpy old crone, which, frankly is what we aspire to as storytellers. But that, and I realized that I was coming from a blaming place. And so it took me forever to roll back the sense of, sort of moral judgment that I was feeling, and find a way to say, wow, all of these, when people are selling advice, then they've got an agenda for people purchasing that advice, not necessarily for that advice achieving the goals that they say it's going to achieve. And with teaching storytelling, one of the crudest form of advice is to give someone a template or a recipe. And So I thought, well, let me just take the templates that are floating out there right now and just look at where they came from and whether they have an agenda or not. And so you can see the current version of the hero template is very, very different than the one I was introduced to, 25 years ago. And so all I'm doing is pointing out, well, look what we've dropped. And look what happened if we would add back in. For instance, adding back in those 3 characters that almost every hero passes on his way to the journey. Every single one of those characters can do nothing to help. They are purely needy, and they're quite often, weak, and will demand some of the resources the hero needs to achieve his goals, his food. And yet in these traditional tales, the hero stops with each one of these 3, and it almost always happens in 3, and shares his food, oils the Tin Man, takes care of the little bird that's the cat's going to eat. And lo and behold, at the end of that story, which is another reason why I rewrote this book, which is to expand the long-term association between these small kindnesses, personal sacrifices, etc., and the long-term goal, which in these stories illustrates that it's the woman who he shared the food with that saves his ass in the end, or I don't need to explain it. You get it.
I can't wait. Thank you.
I worked so hard on it. I really, really did.
On 2 chapters.
2 new chapters, and that's the one chapter, and then the other chapter is this idea that expands the idea that story is what embeds us with the memory of the price of short-term gain for long-term collective well-being. That's what these moral stories, that's what Aesop's fables are. And so while the spin of the stories that are sponsored by corporate storytelling have really been turned to convince someone to buy something, which is always short term. These old stories still have those survival lessons. And so if we want to continue to evolve, i.e. survive on the planet, then it just makes sense to me that we should go back to some of these cherished, pieces of wisdom on how to survive. And one of them is random kindness.
Annette, do you have anything else that you'd like to share?
Well, I think we've gone on long enough. I think I'm just so thrilled to have an opportunity to chat with you, and also to kind of hear myself talk about this thing, because I haven't talked yet too much about the new edition, and it's been really helpful for me. I'll have to watch myself and see if I said some good stuff.
You said some great stuff, and I had a profound lesson during the short time that we've chatted, which is I had lots of questions that I wanted to interrupt you with, and you got to them and answered them in a much richer way. And if I had interrupted, I would have probably limited the richness of your answer. So this
wow. Well, thanks for letting me ramble then.
Thank you for this, and I can't wait to speak again.
All right. Take care.